Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. By far, one of the most talked about programs to start 2024. Dan Lanning, the Oregon Ducks. You go back 3 weeks ago, there were a lot of people picking Oregon to win a national championship. I picked them to win a Big Ten championship, which I still feel pretty good about. That being said, a lot of people in the national media are now questioning if this Oregon team is even a legit national title contender in the 2024 season. I want to get into two different conversations. One, yes, they are still a national title contender. They have the team to win a national championship. But I also want to talk about what needs to be cleaned up for this Oregon team to compete for a national championship. Fired up to get into it now. Before we do, and as always, one to the Oregon fans, let it fly in the comment section. We are up here 2 a.m. Eastern time on Saturday night, I guess Sunday morning, you would say, breaking down what we saw. A lot of you guys had a lot of different thoughts and opinions on this football team, and it was a blast to kind of talk some ball with you guys in the comment section. Let it fly in the comment section. One, do you think this team's still a national title contender? But I think more importantly, the more pressing conversation to have, what does this Oregon team need to clean up heading into the rest of 2024? And of course, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. The amount of support the Oregon fans have continued to show the boys has been amazing. We appreciate you guys. And without further ado, let's get into this one, and let's start with why this team is still a legitimate national title contender. You still have, in my opinion, really good quarterback play, which is normally a prerequisite in terms of being a national championship contender. You look at the teams that, probably aren't national title contenders because they don't have quarterback play. Michigan comes to mind. Notre Dame comes to mind. Oregon still has a quarterback in Dillon Gabriel where you look at the numbers, an 84% completion percentage, 4 touchdowns to 0 interceptions. Those numbers are pretty damn good. And I think, yeah, has Dillon Gabriel been perfect? Absolutely not. Did he miss some throws that he has to make in some of those big games against Boise State? Yeah, he absolutely has. Has he taken some sacks that you can't take? Yeah, for sure. That being said, Dillon Gabriel is still having quite a good start to the season despite offensive line play that hasn't been all that great. Now, there's a couple of different things that I think lead me to think Dillon Gabriel is, I wouldn't say struggling to adjust, but maybe kind of taking a little bit longer to adjust than some of us thought. I think number one, he's coming from a conference in the Big 12 that's used to rushing 3 and dropping 8. And for the last 2 seasons at Oklahoma, that's how a lot of Big 12 defenses play. He did not see a lot of pressures. He did not see a lot of blitzes. He's used to having some time in the backfield to kind of go through his progressions and find his open receivers. You can tell that Dillon Gabriel is, I think, at times a little bit gun shy in terms of getting the football out quickly and on time. And I think part of that is because he's coming from the Big 12. But I think more importantly, he's working with wide receivers that he's had, maybe about 6 months of working together with. I think that continues to get better as the season goes on. And again, I think a large part is the offensive line, and we're going to talk about that in just a second, has really struggled. And when you are behind an offensive line that is struggling to block it up, that can kind of affect your kind of routine and how you're approaching being a passer in the pocket. When you get jittery feet, you want to get outside the pocket because you don't trust the protection in front of you. As Oregon figures out the offensive line, I think Dillon Gabriel is going to get a lot more confident in terms of how to run this offense. Now, number two, and I think the biggest question mark that this Oregon team has in terms of, if you listen to some national media, the big questions people are asking is, does Oregon have the offensive line to be a national championship contender? Which is a very valid question right now, given how Oregon has played the first 2 weeks of the season. They certainly do. Now, you go back to how we talked about this Oregon offensive line in the summer. We thought it could be one of the best units that we saw in the country. And I think it still can. And I think you look at what makes Oregon's offensive line problems different from other programs' problems on the offensive line. You look at some programs who are having problems on the offensive line, they just don't got dudes, right? You can't really fix. If you don't have good enough offensive linemen, it's really hard to fix those problems in a 4-month season. Oregon has the guys. You look on the inside, we know what Poncho and Marcus Harper can do. When Matthew Bedford gets healthy, we know what Matthew Bedford can do. You look at the tackle spot, Josh Connerly Jr. and Johnny Cornelius. Those are two legitimate NFL tackles. And so you look at the personnel in terms of the 5, 6 guys that are going to be working in the rotation. We know those guys are dudes. The biggest problem that Oregon's having right now is the communication on the offensive line. Now, there's a couple of different things that I want to talk about. One, 16% sack rate in terms of Dillon Gabriel dropping back. That's 129th in the country. Went back and charted in the Boise State game the 4 sacks Dillon Gabriel took. Two of them were just free runners. And yeah, Dillon Gabriel might need to have a little bit better of identification. Maybe it kind of comes on Dillon Gabriel in terms of getting the offensive line pass protection right. You certainly miss a guy like Powers Johnson at the center spot. A large part of this Oregon offensive line is struggling with picking up pressure as opposed to just getting beat in their one-on-ones. Now, has the interior offensive line, guys like Charlie Pickard and at times Poncho, struggled in pass protection? Yes, absolutely. But the large majority of Oregon's offensive line problems, specifically in pass protection, have been with the communication, letting guys who are coming in on blitzes run free. And now it's hard to decipher if that's on Dillon Gabriel, if that's on the center, if that's on the tackles and running backs communicating in terms of who's picking up who in pass protection. But you go back and look at the muddy pockets that Dillon Gabriel has had. A lot of that time, it's just free runners that Oregon's just not communicating with on the offensive line. So are you concerned about the offensive line after 2 weeks? Yeah, probably absolutely. But I think what makes you feel better and what makes me at least feel better about this Oregon team is you got quote unquote, and Dan Lanning said this in his press conference, you got fixable mistakes. Other teams just they're going to have bad offensive line throughout 2024 because they don't have the guys up front. Oregon has the guys up front. Now you got to fix the mistakes. I think there's two things that I think can really help this Oregon offensive line. One is staying on schedule more. I would like to see more inside zone and power concepts in the run game. I think that's how this Oregon offensive line is designed to block. I mean, they're big bodies, they're powerful bodies that want to move people off the line of scrimmage. I think you got a running back in Jordan James who excels getting vertically down the field. You go back and look at the film from Idaho and Boise State. What has been one of the biggest problems in terms of Oregon not staying on schedule? Yes, taking sacks. I think more importantly, the penalties. The penalties have been killing this Oregon team, specifically on offense. Those kill drives. And so you look at Oregon's struggles in pass protection. I think a lot of it has to do with being in those third and long situations where opposing defenses have the opportunity to really scheme it up and give you some different looks and bring different pressure packages, which is going to put your offensive line in difficult positions. One of the things that made this Oregon offense so elite last year was they were never behind schedule. They were never in those third and long situations. Bo Nix did not take sacks, and the Oregon offensive line did not commit many penalties. And so it didn't give opposing defenses that many opportunities to really pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. Oregon throughout the first 2 games, whether it's holdings, whether it's negative plays, yes, the holdings, why I say I want to see more inside zone and kind of power concepts is you look at Oregon when they're running some outside stuff, trying to get to the perimeter, the offensive linemen are holding. And they are blatant holds. They're not bad calls. I feel like if you get them more going downhill and just using the big bodies and big powerful bodies, you're going to see one more efficiency in the run game, staying on schedule. But I think more importantly, you're not going to see as many holding penalties. I think secondly, I would go to some more 7-man protections. I mean, you look at the touchdown that Dillon Gabriel threw to Evan Stewart over the middle of the field. There was a 7-man protection. When you have 3 wide receivers in Trayshawn Holden, Evan Stewart, and Tez Johnson, those are guys that even though you're running a 3-man route tree, those are guys that can go down the field and make plays. If you give Dillon Gabriel the time to process and find his open receivers, he's normally going to make those throws. And so I wouldn't mind seeing Oregon, especially as the offensive line continues to, I guess, figure it out, go to some more 7-man protections. Leave a guy like Herbert in, leave a guy like Jordan James in to help in pass protection to make sure we're keeping Dillon Gabriel upright. So we'll see how Oregon moves forward with the offensive line. By far the biggest question mark. I think the conversation about Oregon not being the team we thought they were is kind of overblown because they got really one large problem, and it's a fixable one. Now, going to the defensive side of the football, and I think what really makes this Oregon team, and because the score and it's been sloppy football, it's what's kind of flying under the radar is how good I think Oregon has played on the defensive line, particularly in the biggest question mark we had for this defense, and that was Do you have guys who are difference makers in the pass rush on the defensive line? We have seen that in spades. You go back to 2023, the leading pass rusher in terms of quarterback hurries, which I think is the better metric to go on in terms of evaluating pass rushers. You can look at sacks. I like to look at quarterback hurries more because it kind of gives you a better sense of who's being the most disruptive. Brandon Dorlus had 35. There was not another player on the defensive line that had more than 20. Do you look at the first two games of the season for Oregon? Derek Carmen has 11. He has a 28% pass rush win rate. Jordan Birch has 8, has a 16% pass rush win rate. Jamari Caldwell with 4, 15%. Tatum Tuioti, 4 with 15%. Mateo's played really well. Jordan Birch, we had just mentioned Jordan Birch. My biggest storyline for Oregon that's kind of flying under the radar is that these defensive linemen, specifically a guy like Derek Carmen, I mean, he was worth every penny that Oregon spent on him to come in through the transfer portal. Because I think of Derek Carmen and say that's the difference maker that we kind of lacked for Oregon in the 2023 season. I think the second storyline is this secondary has played really, really good. And I get they haven't necessarily played the most prolific passing attacks. That being said, Jabbar Muhammad, Nico, Brandon Johnson, they've played absolutely nails at the boundary cornerback spot and the slot cornerback spot. I think Brandon Johnson was a massive addition, one that we kind of said in the offseason was one of the most under the radar transfer portal additions Oregon had. You look at those guys, they've been extremely good. And that's not even a shot at guys like Dante Manning, who's been good himself. This Oregon secondary, you take a look at the numbers, they lead the FBS in pass breakups. It's I believe a 43% completion percentage that they've given up to opposing quarterbacks. The secondary has been good. And when you have a secondary that's as good as Oregon, Tosh Luboy can get really creative in terms of the looks and coverages and blitz packages that he wants to bring for this Oregon defense. So I think one of the storylines, and again, it wasn't necessarily reflected against Boise State, because I think you're really trying to tackle just about as good of a running back as I've ever really seen in college football the last 10 years in Ashton Jeanty. They did on average, and Dan Lanning said this in the press conference, we on average did a very good job bottling Ashton Jeanty up. But when you do make a mistake, he goes 70 yards for a touchdown. And we kind of saw that against Boise State Saturday night. Look, Oregon has played sloppy. Dan Lanning and this Oregon team would be the first ones to tell you that. That being said, they have fixable problems. On the other hand, you look at some other teams that I would quote identify as right now not national title contenders. My Michigan Wolverines, you look at a team like Notre Dame, they don't have fixable problems. You look at Michigan and say they just straight up don't have a quarterback that can win a national championship. I'd probably say the same thing from what we saw with Riley Leonard against NIU. You look at Oregon and say legitimate fixable problems. They have the talent to still be a national championship contender. So it's not panic mode, but it's urgency mode for Oregon. We're not panicking about what we have because we know we have a good team, but we got to be urgent in terms of the mistakes we want to fix. We'll see Saturday how they play. We'll recap that game right as it finishes up. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.